This video is brought to you by our patrons. If you want to make sure we can create more content like this, consider supporting us on our Patreon. Thank you. Hi, and welcome to part 2 of chapter 8 of Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy by Joseph A. Schumpeter. This chapter is still called the same thing that it was called last week. So a few words on rigid prices. That is our point number 3. We can define a rigid price as if it is less sensitive to changes in the conditions of demand and supply than it would be if perfect competition prevailed. So as you can imagine, the methods to determine whether prices are rigid will vary, and thus we should view the whole thing with a little bit of skepticism / a grain of salt. But in addition to this, prices are almost certainly less rigid than they appear. There are plenty of reasons why something that, in effect, is a price change would not show up statistically. For example, improving a product at a fixed price should not be viewed as rigidity. Since the same amount of money is now technically buying more, you are, in a sense, now getting a discount. But of course, many cases of actual price rigidity still remain. But we must acknowledge that these are almost always short-run phenomena. Quite elusive is an example of long-run price rigidity. So what is the purpose of this business strategy? To avoid seasonal, random, and cyclical fluctuations in prices and to move only in response to the more fundamental changes in the conditions that underlie those fluctuations. Since these more fundamental changes take time in declaring themselves, this involves moving slowly by discrete steps, keeping to a price until new, relatively durable contours have emerged into view. So here's a question. How does short-run rigidity affect the long-run development of total output? Prices that remain up during periods of recession or depression no doubt influence the business situation during those phases of the cycle. Let's contemplate 2 scenarios. The first one, we're in a recession or depression and a business or industry refuses to decrease their prices, and this industry still sells the same amount as they would if they had reduced the prices. And therefore, they are benefiting financially from their price rigidity. And in addition to this, let's imagine that they keep their profits idle. That is, they don't use the money in a way that filters back into the economy. Well, this is a scenario that we can safely say has been harmful to the total output via price rigidity and the development of idle money that the industry had as a result. But what is the practical importance of such an example? It's doubtful to Schumpeter, since this is not usually what happens. Now, our second scenario in which price rigidity may be harmful is in how it may affect demand, and therefore output, and therefore employment during periods of recession and depression. And of course we mean this in terms of reducing employment and production output beyond what is already just necessary in a period of depression or recession. And Schumpeter argues that there is also a reduced practical importance for this scenario. So if we imagine, for instance, we're in a recession or depression, Tim is going to delay his purchase of a new car regardless of if there's a 25% price fluctuation. Or in other words, purchasing behaviors have already changed so that more minute price fluctuations are not going to affect consumer behavior in a way that it might during periods of no recession or depression. Ultimately, Schumpeter argues that this price rigidity has its benefits, preventing firms or industries from collapsing when they might have otherwise under the pressure of recession or depression. As we have seen before, from a more general standpoint, total output and employment may well keep on a higher level with the restrictions incident to that policy than they would if depression were allowed to play havoc with the price structure. In other words, under the conditions created by capitalist evolution, perfect and universal flexibility of prices might in depression further unstabilize the system, instead of stabilizing it, as it no doubt would under the conditions envisaged by the general theory. So moving on to our 4th point of the chapter, there is this idea that in the era of big business, entrepreneurial activity will be primarily focused on maintaining existing investments. And in the long run, this hinders progress. Schumpeter disagrees, first of all, with the concept that big business has no interest in improvements. The first thing a modern concern does as soon as it feels that it can afford it is to establish a research department every member of which knows that his bread and butter depends on his success in devising improvements. Holding on to antiquated equipment does not significantly benefit the capitalist manager in a way it does not the socialist manager. In fact, both are incentivized to switch out antiquated equipment. The capitalist manager to decrease costs and therefore maximize profits, and the socialist manager for some socialist reason. Everyone is incentivized to get rid of antiquated equipment and bring in improved methods of doing things. Now, there is a sort of caveat exception, which is that people may choose not to update every single time an update is available when they are anticipating that another update is around the corner. To an outsider, this may appear like stifling improvement in order to conserve existing capital values, but this isn't what's happening. Even the most zen comrade would revolt if their socialist management was throwing out and replacing all of the factory equipment every single year. And that's where we will pause for this chapter. There is only one part left, points 5 and 6. And that video will be coming out soon. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit a like and subscribe. Consider joining our Patreon. And have a wonderful week, everyone.